Father, thank you very much. Thank you guys for coming. Delighted to have the opportunity to be with you. Love your questions. Excuse me a sec. Love the questions. I think there's about 65 of them, so we won't get through even close to all of them. I thought maybe I would just take a few and start talking, but what I'm really eager to do is hear more from you. So maybe if I say something that triggers a further question, bring it up, or let's just kind of have a conversation for the next, 45 minutes. But maybe I'll start with a couple of these that have struck me. Let's see. Some are more kind of the personal, vocation life story. Let's see. There's a lot about, priesthood. What inspired me to be a priest? How do you know? What's that one? How do you know you're being called? How do you recognize the call? That sort of thing. And I hope it's clear that it's never like just one thing, like Paul on the road to Damascus. I mean, sometimes people do have that kind of extraordinary conversion experience, or it just happens. But usually it's a kind of accumulation of things over time, right? And I told you a big part of it this morning. That's true. What happened to me here when I was your age or younger than some of you, that was a big part of it. And I'm from a Catholic family. Went to Mass every Sunday. My parents were, devout people, so I was around religion and religious things. But when I was in, grade school and when I came here, as I say, I wanted to be a baseball player. Sports was probably the most important thing in my life at that point. If I read books about sports. I read books about, football players and basketball players and baseball and that kind of stuff. So that was my real interest. If you had pressed me a little bit, I might have said lawyer or a politician, like I was thinking along those lines. It would not have been priesthood. But that Fenwick experience was very powerful. And it was, as I say, like the planting of a seed, or it was like the opening of a door, the opening of a window, that I went through with some enthusiasm. And then the more I read and studied about God, the more real God appeared to me. The more real God appeared to me, the clearer it became that, well, if God exists, and He really does, and if God is a supreme good, and He surely is, then why wouldn't I want to give my whole life to God? I mean, that's how my thinking, I think, moved. Doesn't mean everyone's got to think the same way, but that's how it happened for me. And I began reading people like Thomas Merton. Do you know that name? Thomas Merton, one of the great spiritual writers of the last century. And reading him in conjunction with Thomas Aquinas was a powerful kind of 1-2 punch, because Thomas addressed the mind very powerfully. Merton addressed more of the heart and the emotions, So the coming together of those two things was very important to me. But then, I entered the seminary after 1 year of college. I went to Notre Dame University my first year, and then I entered the seminary. And then even during my seminary years, though, there were times when it became less clear, less obvious to me. At one point when I was studying at Catholic U in Washington, I thought, no, I don't think the priesthood's it. I think I want to be a philosophy professor. So I really got into the academic side of it. And then it reasserted itself, So it's a long sort of process of trial and error, of this and that, and this influence and that influence, until you're finally pushed to the point of saying yes, Once I joined the major seminary here in Chicago at Mundelein, I really didn't have any further doubt about it. And then I must say, all the years I've been a priest, I've loved it, I've enjoyed it, I've never looked back. But I always say to people, to married people, when they say, how come you became a priest? I'll say, well, how come you married that lady? Because there's never an answer like, oh, just, one day it was just perfectly clear to me. No, it was over kind of a long period of time and through a long process of getting to know each other, etc. It's like that, I think, with priesthood. But here's a general idea with any vocation, is what gives you the greatest sense of joy. And again, you guys know this. Joy does not mean like superficial emotions, like, I'm happy for 5 minutes. Joy, Thomas would have called it beatitudo, right? Beatitude. Peace, maybe you'd call it, or the deep contentment of the heart. What gives you that? And for me, over an extended period of time, it was the idea of the priesthood. Gave me this sort of sense of contentment, or of peace or of joy, you know? The same is true now with whatever your vocation is. And I mean that in terms of your relationships, in terms of your job. What gives you that sense of deep level contentment? That's, I think, where it comes from. Let's see. Where'd you go to school? I mentioned a couple. I mean, from Fenwick to Bennett Academy out in Lisle, Notre Dame University for a year, the college seminary in Chicago for a year. Then I got a scholarship to Catholic U in Washington. 3 years there, get a master's degree. Then Mundelein. I don't know why I'm pointing that way. I don't know what Mundelein is from here north. Mundelein for 4 years. And then I went to the Institut Catholique in Paris for 3 years and got a doctorate there. So I did, a lot of studies over many years. How'd you become a bishop? You get a phone call from the apostolic nuncio. It comes totally out of the blue. I mean, priesthood, at least you have a lot of years to kind of think about it, and you pray about it, and you go through formation, and but bishop, believe me, is not like that. You get a phone call, and this voice says, the Holy Father has appointed you, in my case, Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles. Do you accept? That's the phone call. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was watching golf in my shorts and t-shirt, and I'm like, what? I mean, it just, none of it made sense to me. But, it's the Pope's representative calls you. And so I said, okay, And then he said, good, the announcement will be next week. So that's how you become a bishop. That's how it happens. What's it like being a bishop? I've enjoyed it. I'm in charge of a big pastoral region. So the LA Archdiocese is the biggest in the country. It's giant, like 5 million Catholics. So we got Chicago's at 2.3 million, I think. So we're more than twice the size of Chicago. I am in charge of this huge area. It's Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. So it covers about 147 miles from end to end, about 650,000 Catholics. So my region is bigger than most dioceses in the country. And I've got about 40 parishes, about 6 high schools, and different institutions. And so I have an administrative kind of side to my life. But a lot of being a bishop is teaching, because whenever you show up anywhere, I'm at a school, I go to a parish, I'm doing a confirmation, whatever I'm doing, I'm always preaching, right, or teaching, or engaging people somehow. So a lot of it is teaching. And then you're also a liturgical person. So a bishop is a kind of high priest in our system, We say the bishop has the fullness of the priesthood. And what that looks like on the ground, I think, is when I go into a parish in my region, let's say, is I'm there kind of representing the universal church, which is why I wear the mitre, and So being a bishop is being a priest, liturgical stuff, being a prophet, a lot of teaching, and being a king, which means you kind of govern and do administration. That's what it's like being a bishop. What's the greatest takeaway from attending a Catholic school? I told you this morning in some ways, but I'd say it's a sense of God. You guys know this because your peers are going through this like mad, is the rising tide of secularism. It's the greatest threat to us right now. And I say that, I don't mean it just like it's an institutional threat. It's an existential threat. Do you know what I mean? It's a threat to our very hearts. Because as I mentioned this morning, we're wired for God. Therefore, when the culture keeps telling us there's no God, don't worry about it, no God, it's all fantasy, it's all an illusion, it does damage to the heart. And so what I took away from my Catholic formation, and as weak as it was in some ways, I came of age after the council, and it wasn't a golden age, frankly, of Catholic education. Father Paulson was like a light in the darkness in some ways, So it wasn't a great period, but Catholic education gave me, I think, a sense of God that I've never lost. And that's indispensably important, because, I'll speak now as a pastor, and you guys, I'm sure, you know this from your own experience. It does huge damage to people when God is denied. Do you know what I'm saying? Whether you do that intellectually or do it more existentially, when you deny God, it does great damage to the heart, because people start flailing about. We're wired for God, for happiness, for joy. And if you say there's no God, well then I guess I have to find it in one of those big four I mentioned this morning, right? Wealth, pleasure, honor, power. Well, what happens is you inevitably get addicted to them. You see why? Because you'll strive and strive and strive to get those four things. They will not satisfy your heart. They're not meant to. They can't, even in principle. So then you panic. I see it happen. It's all the time, pastorally. All the time it happens. People panic. I need more of it. I need more of those things. That's why I'm not happy. I need more honor, more pleasure, more. And then before you know it, they're caught in this dreadful addictive pattern. Thomas would have called that concupiscencia, by the way. Concupiscence. But I think we could translate that very well as addiction. And we all know about that, right? Talk to someone addicted to pornography. I mean, I know your generation and older because of the internet. I mean, pornography is a huge issue. It was for seminarians because growing up with the internet, you know, in a way that my generation didn't. In that way, thank God. But talk about like pleasure. Pleasure, that's what my life's all about. Man, you get addicted to that immediately and watch a life spiral downward from those addictions. So see, God is the way out of that. Read the whole Bible now under that rubric of like, what's the way out of addiction? The Bible calls it right worship. I'm giving a little theology class here, but that's where it fits together, it seems to me, is right worship, meaning what's of highest value to you? And you say, well, God is of highest value. Good. Now you're rightly ordered. And now, as I said this morning, now you know what to do with wealth, pleasure, honor, and power. You know, like pleasure. Are we anti-pleasure as Catholics? No, we're not. We're not puritanical. I don't like Puritanism. I'm against Puritanism. And whenever it comes up, the church has opposed it. You know, forms of dualism or, you know, like spirit's good, matter's bad. Church has never liked that view because the Bible says whatever God made is good, right? So therefore, pleasure and sex and food and drink, church loves that. Have you guys read Chesterton yet? G.K. Chesterton? Do you read him at all? His great friend Hilaire Belloc had the famous line, wherever the Catholic sun does shine, there's music and laughter and good red wine. See, that's good. That's the Catholic sensibility. We like pleasure. But pleasure under the aegis of the love of God. Then you get it rightly ordered. Without God, pleasure runs amok and you get addicted. Trust me. You see it all the time, right? Same with power. Read any story from Richard III and Shakespeare to today's politicians, right? The same thing. Power, power, power. I want more of it. You know? I remember in a Game of Thrones episode recently, someone said, what does he want? And the answer came back, what do powerful men always want? And the right answer was more power. See, that's exactly how it works. Game of Thrones is good there because all those people are awful. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if you guys watch Game of Thrones or you shouldn't watch it, but all those people are awful in that show. But it's good to show that. It's like The Sopranos or something. All those people are awful because they're caught in these terrible addictions. What do powerful men want? More power. See, but what you should say is, no, I want God. And therefore, I'll know what to do with power when I have it. Not just to want more and more and more of it. Ho hum, you know. Anyway, I'm bazooing a bit there, but that's, I think, important stuff spiritually. Let's see. How about, do you believe in purgatory? Yes, I do, and I like the doctrine of purgatory. I thank God for it in some ways, right? That, how do most of us die? Do most of us die like Mother Teresa? I mean, like flawless saints? Not in my experience. You know. Most of us die, you know, I would say friends with God in at least a general sense, but in need of tremendous purgation, right? What's purgatory is a way of gesturing toward the fact that even after death, something like a purification or purgation of our addictions. See, I translate all the classical language that way for us. What are you addicted to? Most of us die friends with God, but still addicted to things. How do we get purged of that? That's purgatory. Now read Dante if you want. Have you guys read the Divine Comedy yet at all? You know, a very highly accomplished and imaginative poem about heaven, hell, and purgatory. But the idea is there. Remember in the Purgatorio, they have to walk up the 7-story mountain, and it's the 7 deadly sins they have to be purged of. Do you guys know them? It's really important for your own life. Pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. Call them the 7 deadly addictions if you want, right? And so purgatory is, okay, how do you get cleansed and purified of these addictions? So I thank God for purgatory, you know. Do you have any further goals in terms of your faith life? Yeah, to be a saint. And I'm a long way. but that's what your goal should be. That's what everyone should want. Right? That's what Aquinas, that's the Aquinas answer to the Lord, is what do you want? Non nisi te Domine, I want you, as Thomas looks down at me there. But you should want to be a saint. Do you know that I mentioned Merton, and if you guys read the Seven-Story Mountain, his great book, title taken from Dante, because Merton saw his time in the Trappist monastery as dealing with the 7 deadly sins, right? But anyway, there's a famous scene in that book where he's walking with his friend Robert Lax, who became a great poet, famous poet. And Lax had just become a Catholic along with Merton. And he said, Tom, what do you want in life? And Merton said, I guess I want to be a good Catholic. And Lax said, no. You should want to be a saint. And it threw Merton off, but he said that was the right answer, So that's the goal, that's my goal. I want to be a saint. But that's everyone's goal, and it's what the church exists for. That's the one reason. That's what priests exist for, to help make people saints. That's our one reason for being, right? Let's see. What sacred place have you visited that inspired you the most? I lived in Paris for 3 years, and dear Notre Dame Cathedral that we saw last week, burning down, it was so heartrending because that was a very sacred place for me. Sainte-Chapelle, which is on the Ile de la Cité, right near Notre Dame, was a very charged place for me. But another one is Namugongo. I don't know if you guys, did you watch some of the Catholicism series? When I had that one from, what episode is that in? When I go to talk about Charles Lwanga. He's the young guy, only 25 years old, and he was put to death because he wouldn't deny his faith, along with his companions. And he was put to death in this kind of out-of-the-way place outside of the capital city at the time. And anyone watching that would have said, there's the end of Christianity. But to that spot, every year on the feast day of Charles Lwanga, June the 3rd, I think it is, 500,000 people come, 500,000 people come. And our film crew went there. And we drove up to the place, and then just oceans of people begin descending on the spot. And you see they have it marked where Charles Lwanga was burned to death, And you think, wow, his persecutors thought, we've dealt with this problem of Christianity. But, from that point, it grew, and now Christianity is growing incredibly in Africa. But you see it there, So Namugongo was a really sacred place for me. How about I do one more, then I want to hear more from you guys. Let's do one more. Yeah, good. I've been really doubting that God exists, or that if God exists, God cares for me. Do you have any encouragement for high schoolers like me? Good. I mean, you're in the same boat as a lot of people, and I know especially today. See, you guys are, you're like 14, 15, 16, 17, that age group. The world's changed a lot. Like when I was your age, the culture was still very religious. I'll talk about it tonight, in fact, with at the event tonight, but 97% of our country, when I was here at Fenwick, believed in God, and claimed a religious identity. 97% of the country. Everybody. I remember Sunday was a very different day when I was a kid. People went to church, and there was a different feel to Sunday. You guys are growing up in a far more secularized world, because now the number is 25% of our country now claims no religion. That's huge change over 40 some years, And especially among younger people, 30 and younger, the number is now 40% claim no religion. Among young Catholics, by the way, 50% under 30 claim no religion. So I get it. A lot of you are struggling with that. Now, the reasons are multiple. Do you guys know of or read the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, those people? Does that ring any bells? Thank God, in a way. These are figures that emerged after September 11th, so go back to like the early zeros. And Hitchens was a very sharp, very witty, very caustic speaker, And Sam Harris, same thing. Go on YouTube, you see all kinds of debates and stuff with those guys. Very articulate, very sharp. They hate religion. And they think religion is not like neutral, it's bad. It's, as Hitchens said, it poisons everything, right? So those guys emerged after September 11th. And then September 11th. Now you guys, you weren't even born yet, but that confirmed an old prejudice that, oh, religion is irrational, therefore it's violent. And you see it, people they fly airplanes into buildings because they can't argue this stuff. All they can do is kill each other over it, right? Well, read Voltaire and read Leibniz and Descartes. You'll find similar things in the Enlightenment. Read Thomas Jefferson. You see the same argument, My point is, you guys grew up, maybe without fully knowing it, in a culture shaped by these attitudes. So I get why atheism or non-belief is more of a problem for you. Maybe it's more of an issue for you. So what's my recommendation? As I look up at Aquinas there and think of his influence on me, do exercise your mind around these things. Don't just go by emotion. Very often in religious discussions, people on both sides just get real emotional about it. There are darn good arguments for God's existence. Now, is each one absolutely clinching and convincing? Well, no, probably not. But are they powerful? And are they importantly indicative? Yes, it seems to me. There are a number of good books out now that go through maybe up to 20 of the major arguments that have been used in the course of our tradition. Read them. If you're doubting God, read some of the serious people that have written about this issue. Here's a quick way to at least get toward it. We live in a radically contingent world. It's just a philosophically technical way of saying a world that exists but doesn't have to, right? And I mean, the proof of that is I can take this paper and crumple it up and then put it in the fire and it burns up in a few seconds. It's evanescent, right? It is, but it doesn't have to be. It came into being, it passes out of being. And I can see that in the case of the paper, but it's true of everything, right? This room came into being. It'll pass out of being. No matter how permanent it looks, eventually it will, right? The planet itself came into being at a certain point. At a certain point, it'll pass out of being. That means that things that in our experience are marked by contingency, a fancy way of saying that they've been caused, right? Think of all that contributed to this state of affairs right now. So here we all are, sitting in this lovely chapel talking about religion. What makes that possible? Well, your desire to be here, the presence of these pews, the fact that the temperature is such that we can all exist in it, the fact that there's oxygen that we can all breathe, the fact that the floor is stable, those are all the conditions for the possibility of this state of affairs obtaining, right? And you say, okay, yeah, I get that. But then, where did all those states of affairs come from? How do you explain the presence of oxygen in this room? Well, then you appeal to other kinds of physical factors, right? Including gravity, which holds it here. How do you explain the stability of the floor? Well, the stability of the ground underneath us. How do you explain the temperature? Well, it's the temperature outside, which is conditioned by atmospheric conditions, et cetera, right? What am I doing is by a very healthy instinct, and every scientist knows it, is I'm looking for causes. And I see that each event is conditioned by a nexus of causes, which are themselves conditioned by a nexus of causes, which themselves are conditioned by a nexus of causes, right? And again, any scientist follows this kind of thinking, whether it's biology, chemistry, physics, or psychology, right? Now, Thomas Aquinas, what's the one thing you can't do? You can't simply appeal endlessly to this kind of causal explanation. Why? Because if you take away the first element in that kind of causal series, you take away all the other causes, which in turn takes away the state of affairs obtaining right before our eyes. Which is why Thomas would say the very fact that we're here, living and moving and having our being, is dependent ultimately upon some reality that is in a necessary way, that has to be, that is not conditioned by causes extrinsic to itself. And this, he says, all people call God. So whether we call it prime mover, uncaused cause, necessary being, it's the condition for the possibility of a contingent world. Now, what I've just done there is run through very quickly a version of the argument I heard when I was 14 in this school. But is a classic approach to the issue of God, construed more intellectually. So that's a long answer to that question of what might you recommend. There are very interesting intellectual paths you can and should follow as you look into the question of God. Okay, I said about one more, then I want to hear from you guys. Are the church's followers declining in number? Yes, sadly. This is under the heading of scandals. For every one person joining the Catholic Church today, 6 are leaving. So that's not good. This is part of the secularism of our time. There are people coming in the church. In fact, we just had a whole slew this past Easter, right? I presided at 2 big ceremonies out in my region of welcoming new Catholics. But for every one Catholic entering, there are 6 leaving. You know where one of the battle lines is? It's high school. They're saying that people are leaving the church younger and younger. In fact, the median age, the last survey I read, was 13. Younger than you guys. So that's a little bit of encouragement too to all of you that one of the battle lines in the struggle for the church is right at your time. So Dominican preachers, you guys, get in there. It's a big fight we got. Get in the front lines. Talk about the faith in a smart way. Live it in a compelling way. Serve the poor. Worship God. Announce the faith. You know. So yeah, the sad thing is we are losing numbers, but that's a call to arms. It seems to me. It's a call to action for you guys. Okay, I've been bazooing a little bit too much. Talk to me. What else is on your mind? What's? Go ahead, please.
Okay. So.
Oh, sorry. The gentleman first, then I'll go to you, please. Very polite.
I have kind of a strange question, but so a lot of scientists believe that there is life on other planets. So if that's true, did Jesus die for their sins too, or just ours?
Yeah, the question is about life on other planets, and if there's intelligent life, you mean on other planets, did Jesus die for them as well? One way to look at that is the creed says, for us men and our salvation, right? So what we're declaring as Christians is, for us, the Word became flesh, dwelt among us, died for our sins, and so on. Is it possible to speculate, let's say somewhere in a galaxy far, far away, there's intelligent life. Might there be another incarnation of the Logos, of the Word, to save sinners in that environment? I think it's okay to speculate along those lines, possibly. The Creed commits us to saying, for us and for our salvation, the Word became flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. Might we think of the Logos becoming flesh in another, planetary system or something? Yeah, maybe. But again, it's highly speculative. I just stick with the thrust of the Creed. Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned the temple Notre Dame burning down, and I wanted to ask, what did you think of the importance of the church itself as a building? Since people literally hours after send millions of dollars to get it rebuilt, but wouldn't do that on a day-to-day basis to help other people.
Yeah.
Like actual people instead of just pieces of wood.
Yeah. The question is about Notre Dame. Recently, the fire that destroyed the roof and the spire, and then people responded with this extraordinary outpouring of generosity and so on. But then it raises the question, why isn't there a similar outpouring in regard to the poor and the hungry and so on? I don't think it's an either or, because the church does, I'll speak just for the church, not for the wider society, but the church does reach out in a very extraordinary way to help the poor. Outside of fully funded government programs, by far the most effective and the most thorough outreaches to the poor are done by the Catholic Church. Look at Catholic relief services is just one example. So there is, I think, extraordinary generosity. Having said that, it's not just stone and glass and wood. I mean, there is something of extraordinary power in a place like Notre Dame. The good, the true, and the beautiful, all are at play in the religious context. You're appealing to the good, which is altogether right, that we're committed to great acts of helping the poor. It's part of the church's work. The church, though, is also committed to the truth. Think of Thomas Aquinas, who spent his whole life pursuing the truth. It's also committed to the beautiful. And it's one of the marks of Catholicism that we never bracketed the beautiful. Not always true, by the way, in Christian religions. Certainly not in puritanical forms of religion, that they don't like the beautiful. I mean, look around. Catholics like beautiful things. And so something like Notre Dame is not secondary to the church's concern. I would say it's all part of this great whole of the good, the true, and the beautiful. All three matter. Now, you could quarrel about, prudential judgments of which one's getting the right amount of attention. But I think all three are deeply important in the church's life. Who else? Go ahead, please.
So you said in your assembly that you called yourself an evangelist. What does that mean to you and why do you believe that you are?
Yeah, good. So the question is about being an evangelist and what does it mean? Well, the word evangelion in Greek, it means good tidings, right? Glad tidings. So gospel translates that, Godspell, right? Good news. The first evangelists were those who announced Jesus risen from the dead. And I've often made the comparison in the ancient world, Caesar had evangelists, quite literally. He'd send people around with the good news that he won a victory. That was the evangelion. So the first Christians were being very edgy when they said, no, we've got the evangelion. We're the real evangelists. And it's about Jesus, someone that Caesar killed but God raised up. So, and that's, by the way, why they were almost all killed. See, the Romans totally got it. They totally understood what they were doing and how edgy it was when they said, no, you're not the evangelists, we are. You don't have the good news, we've got it. And that's why they killed them all. So that's what I'm doing. I'm announcing the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, from that point, you can extrapolate like mad. You can go out like mad and talk about God, about morality, about the church, about the sacraments, about life and death, about heaven and hell, right? But the core of it is always the good news that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. Does our culture need that message? Yes, as much as any culture needs it, maybe more so, because it seems it's opaque to many people today. That's what it means, and that's why I do it, I'd say. Please, go ahead.
I'm in Bible class right now, talking about evolution.
Yeah.
Obviously the church accepts evolution, but how does Adam and Eve factor into that? It's kind of confusing.
Yeah, there in some ways it's apples and oranges. So a text like the beginning of Genesis is not a scientific text, not an anthropological text. It's a theological text with a strong spiritual message about the world being created by God, about human beings' role within creation, about the nature of sin, about God's desire for us, about the seeds of salvation. It's all about that. People make a category mistake when they say, oh, it's a rival scientific account. Just keep in mind that the first scientific writings we have date from the 16th century, The latest biblical text is written around the year 100. And so just ipso facto, they're not scientific texts. Now, does that mean unintelligent texts? By no means. Does that mean unimportant texts? Absolutely not. The trouble is a scientism, and that's a real rampant problem today, right? That the only legitimate knowledge is scientific knowledge. No. Scientific knowledge is great. And how did evolution unfold? Ask the scientists. I'll take their word for it. I'll read those texts and thanks, great. That's what I want to find out. But now, what are the theological and spiritual implications of creation and so on? I'm going to ask the biblical author those questions. So in some ways, the problem there comes from a category mistake, that we're trying to compare things that just can't be compared. And that's, I think, part of the Catholic genius is to avoid that false dilemma. Yeah, please.
Do you think it's the government's job to heavily tax the rich and use the money spent forward, or that decisions solely up to the rich man?
Well, if you're asking me as a bishop, I'd say, yeah, I don't have an opinion about that. You could ask me personally, and I might have an opinion about, the best prudential course to take politically, but the church doesn't pronounce on the details of, let's say, tax policy. So I know Democrats and Republicans of goodwill who have different views on how best to tax, to redistribute wealth, to set up equity in the society. I'll let them debate that. The church would say, we support the market, and Catholic social teaching supports the free market, but it wants a free market that involves as many people as possible, that doesn't let too many slide off to the side, that wants as full a participation as possible, and therefore calls government to be involved when it should. Now, that's what the church will say. The details of that, I'd leave that. Speaking as a bishop, I'd leave that to the politicians. Now, you can ask me my private opinion, and I might say, yeah, I hate that Republican tax policy, or those Democrats are, they're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. Sure, we can debate about that. But as a bishop, I won't get involved in that one. So no, the church as such wouldn't descend into the weeds, let's say, of tax legislation, if that makes sense. Even though we say things about the moral demand that surrounds the market economy. Please, go ahead.
So you were talking about the three transcendentals and especially beauty in regards to Notre Dame. So I don't know, I think in a lot of ways the sense of the beautiful is kind of being destroyed around us. Like there's some pretty heinous architecture and art being created that are, that just I don't think in any way can be considered beautiful, but are now like commonplace. So I guess how do we restore that sense of the beautiful in our generation?
Yeah, good. The question is about the beautiful, which is the third transcendental, and then the quality of a lot of, especially religious, art, or even in general, urban architecture that is not particularly beautiful. Now, I'd say a couple things. One is, be careful about maybe over-specifying or over-defining a particular form of the beautiful. I mean, the beautiful can take a lot of different forms. The Aquinas says that the three things required for the beautiful are integritas, consonantia, and claritas, right? Wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Is Notre Dame Cathedral beautiful? It seems to me eminently so on those criteria. Is a Cézanne still life beautiful? I would say absolutely on those criteria. I was at the National Gallery in Washington a few months ago for the USCCB meetings. We had a morning off, so I went down to the National Gallery. And especially early Picasso, I just find those pictures staggeringly beautiful, So I wouldn't want to over-define it, like it's only classical forms of beauty are beautiful. But on the other hand, I take your point. I think there has been a lot of less than beautiful things, especially in architecture when a kind of functionalism took over. And anything approaching decoration or beautiful for its own sake became questionable, was seen as kind of bourgeois, and I think we suffered from that. And the church, again, in my judgment, take it for what it's worth, in my judgment, imbibed a little too much of, especially architectural modernism, which doesn't bear the Christian mystery very well. Now, I'm not going to push it too much further, but I think the recovery of the beautiful indeed is a great demand in the life of the church today. And it's not incidental or simply accidental to the spiritual life. It's essential to it, So work on, are you interested in the arts and architecture?
No, I was reading a little bit.
Yeah. Because what I'd say, seriously, go into it then. I mean, go into architecture and say, look, I'll dedicate my life to making beautiful buildings. Good, go into it. Please.
So I know a lot of people who feel like they have a relationship with God, but their relationship with God doesn't have to do anything with the institution of the church.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who feels like that their relationship with God can flourish outside of the church? Because I have a lot of friends who they don't go to church anymore, or they feel like the Eucharist isn't an important part of their Catholic or Christian life. How would you call them back to that?
Yeah, good. It's a good question about, call it, being spiritual but not being religious. having a sense of God, but not the institutional church, etc. And that's an age-old problem. That goes way back. Almost every generation will wrestle in some way with that problem. And it's charism versus institution is a way to put that. And you'll see it up and down the centuries. That you have great charismatic figures that are in touch with God and spiritual things, and they kind of chafe against the institution. The institution kind of chafes against them. One generation's heretic is the next generation's saint, because the institution found a way to kind of, take them in. So it's a good question. It's an old question. The Catholic approach, it seems to me, in most things is both and, right? We're the great both and religion. We tend not to like either or solutions. We like both and solutions. I'll put it this way. There's a guy named Will Hertzberg that wrote a book many years ago about religion, and he has what he calls the cut flower theory. Can I just leave it there for a second? Is that going to fall on you? If you cut flowers out of the ground, right, and you put them in a vase, they'll look pretty good for a while. They will. They're like, beautiful. Look at that. But in a short period of time, those flowers are going to fade, right? In a way, the impulse to say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, or I'm not institutional, is like that. It's like cutting the flower of an institution off from its source, putting it in a kind of artificial environment, and saying, hey, it's great, look at it flourish. But in the long run, it won't flourish. Because, let's face it, everyone in this room, whatever we know about God, we've gotten, at least to some degree, from an institution, right? It was people that put books together, liturgies and the Mass, and my parents teaching me prayers that they had learned from their institutional background. That in a way, we all got our sense of God from an institution, right? Now, does the institution sometimes get stodgy and needs to be kind of shaken up and it gets too conservative? Yeah. And that's why you need these great charismatic figures like Francis or Dominic and Mother Teresa to kind of shake it up. But don't allow the charismatic to just divorce itself from the institutional. So I would tell people that maybe is don't fall prey to the cut flower theory of religion, because, and I've seen it all the time. Hey, I'm very spiritual, I'm just not very religious. Yeah, but you won't be spiritual that much longer. If you doubt me, read a woman named Jean Twenge. She teaches out in San Diego. Wrote a book, it's about your generation, called iGen, right? So like iPhone, iGen. And she has this very interesting book, but the chapter on religion. And she says, now people like you, your generation, is getting both less religious and less spiritual. We used to say, oh, don't worry, they're not very, religious, but they're still really spiritual. Her very extensive studies are showing, no, I'm afraid they're now less religious and less spiritual, which would make sense. Take the flowers out of the ground, they're not going to last that long, So I guess I'd say, I'd urge your friends, no, give the institution a little more of a chance. That you got your religion from it, like it or not, and now return to it and breathe some life into it, but don't abandon it. Please, go ahead.
I know it's kind of a difficult concept, but how do you justify the reason for why bad things happen to good people? I know it's just kind of a different question.
No, the question is, why do bad things happen to good people? The problem of suffering. There's no greater objection to God. It's the most powerful argument against religious faith, no question about it. And watch it being raised by every single generation. It's the oldest question in theology. We call it, by the way, theodicy, which is to justify the ways of God in the presence of evil, right? Have you read Dostoevsky yet? You guys read Dostoevsky yet? The Brothers Karamazov? Someday, if you have the stomach for it, you can get through that book. But there's a section in that book where Dostoevsky, who was a profoundly religious man, deeply believing Christian, but he allows one of his characters, Ivan, to tell this terrible series of stories about children being tortured and finally killed by wicked people. Now, what's his point? Well, Ivan is a fierce atheist, and he's trying to convince his brother, Alyosha, who's a monk, to abandon his faith. I don't know any better presentation of it in the whole tradition than that book. Of, explain that to me, man. So you just gave me, an argument for God from Thomas Aquinas. Okay, I get it, first cause and all that. But explain that to me, man. Children who are being tortured to death by wicked people. How about the Sri Lankan thing from a few days ago? Explain that to me. So I get it. Go on YouTube, watch Hitchens and Dawkins, but watch, what's his name, the comedian, Stephen Fry, who's a fierce atheist. And that's how he leads. And just, he's like Ivan Karamazov, just relentlessly, children dying of leukemia, and these awful, flesh-eating diseases that are attacking children. So my point in saying that is, I totally get it. I get how that's the great objection. Now, having set it up that way, here's my answer. I don't know. Now, I don't mean that in a flip way. I really don't. And for the details, read the book of Job. But here's my point. For that argument to work, even though I totally understand it at the emotional level, you know what I'm saying? I totally get it in my bones why this is such a huge problem. But for that argument to work logically, I would have to assume that I have a godlike grasp of all of space and all of time. Because see, the claim being made is these things, so Ivan Karamazov and Stephen Fry and Sri Lanka, everything the claim is those things cannot be justified. There's nothing that would ever justify the permission of that kind of evil. But see, the very obvious comeback is, how are you even possibly in a position to make that kind of judgment? You'd have to have a godlike knowledge of all of space and all of time to be able to say with that kind of confidence, that has no justification. Now, I'm going to go some way sublime and ridiculous, but with an example. Think of a father trying to explain to his 2-year-old child surgery. Right? So the 2-year-old having to go through some horrific surgery. The 2-year-old in his mind can grasp, I'm going through this horrific suffering. My father, whose job it seems to me is to love me and get this sort of stuff away from me, right, is right here. And I don't get it. This is just the dumbest suffering, and I blame him, right? But now, you're the father in that scenario. You would love to be able to explain surgery to that child. That, look, there's this thing that they have to go in and get it out of you, and they have to cut you open, and it's really going to hurt, but it's going to make you better in the long run, right? And so, sure, we understand all that. Take that scenario now to the nth degree and apply it to God. So, yes, these horrific sufferings that we go through, who can deny them? And with Thomas Aquinas in mind, we say, and yet God exists, right? How could you possibly do this? Well, we're like the 2-year-old, but even more so because there's an infinite qualitative difference between our minds and God's mind. See, so emotionally, I totally get that argument. Intellectually, it's actually not a very good argument because its second premise is a completely invalid and impossible assumption that I have a godlike command. Does good come out of evil? Because what's Thomas's classic answer? In typically Laconic Latin, Thomas says, God permits suffering so as to bring about a greater good. Okay, yeah, all right, I get it. And sometimes we see that happening. Are we always going to see it happening? No, typically we don't. We don't see the greater good. Does that surprise us? We have these little teeny tiny minds that grasp a little tiny swath of space and time. You see how I'm driving at? So it's the question. It's the question. It's been asked by every single thoughtful person up and down the ages who wants to have religious faith. And I think Thomas Again, don't tell a suffering person like, oh, here's the argument. But it's the best way to state it. God permits suffering and evil to bring about a good, but we can't always see it. End of totally inadequate answer to that question, but go ahead.
I have a question about prayer.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel awkward praying for myself because I feel like there's other people who need prayers a lot more than I do. Is there a certain time when it's okay to pray for yourself, or what's?
Yeah, good. It's a question about prayer and praying for yourself or praying for others. Sure, both and. Why not? I pray for help all the time, in a way praying for myself, you know. I do a holy hour every day. So I begin my day, I wake up super early and I just want to begin the day in the holy hour. And that's one way to do it. You might take 15 minutes praying for yourself. Like, Lord, help me. I'm kind of lost. I'm worried about this. I don't know what's going on. I don't feel well. Fine. Then next 15 minutes, pray for everyone that's asked you to pray for them. Next 15 minutes, pray in thanksgiving. Last 15 minutes, just sit there in the presence of God, you know, or something like that. But I think it's fine to do both those things. Pray for yourself. But we pray for each other. That's the beautiful thing, right? So maybe you don't have the time to pray for yourself, but someone else, a friend of yours, is praying for you. And in God's great economy, that's a wonderful part of Aquinas, by the way, to read him on prayer. In God's great economy, that's working itself out, you know. But both and, I'd say. Please, go ahead.
What made you decide that you wanted to just do the film, the Catholicism series, instead of pursuing like a more traditional?
Yeah, good. The question is about the Catholicism series and using all the films and videos and everything. I've told this story before, but it was a priest friend here in Chicago, Monsignor Wayne Prist, and we were talking. This is back in the '90s, you know, late '90s, and I was complaining about how Catholics are behind the curve and we don't do enough with this new social media and blah, blah, blah. And he turned to me and said, well, what are you doing about it? And at the time, I wasn't doing anything about it. I was writing books and teaching classes and stuff. So that kind of lit a fire under me, I must say. What are you doing about it? So I went to WGN here in Chicago and got on the radio. The radio led to a website. Website led to videos of talks I've given. That led to EWTN, picked those up, and then eventually the Catholicism series. I just thought, look, why wouldn't you use it? Why wouldn't you do it now? It's the greatest tool we have, especially for people, let's say 40 and younger. And as they're leaving the church in droves, here's a way we can reach out. Then when the social media kicked in, I thought, man, this is God's providence. And we have this tool right now, you know, to reach young people that would never come to church. They wouldn't dream of coming to some program at our parish, but I can invade their space, you know, with a YouTube commentary. And if you doubt that non-believers watch my stuff, read the comments sometimes. The amount of negativity, but I don't mind that at all. I kind of like that actually, because it means I'm getting way outside the church. So that's what led me to it. It was just a missionary sort of impulse, you know. Good. Go ahead, please.
So I know a lot of non-Catholic friends that I have, and a lot of them kind of look at the Catholic Church with like I don't know, like hostility kind of, and there are a lot of things that they assume about the Catholic Church that just aren't true. Like for example, I know a couple of people who think Catholics hate gays, like Catholics don't like the LGBTQ plus community, which obviously isn't really the true teaching. How do you suggest that we get people to believe the true teaching of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, good. So the question is about anti-Catholicism, where people are suspicious of the church, especially in regard to sexual teaching and about gays, especially in gay marriage and transgender stuff and all that. I'll make one quick comment. I know we have to bring it to a close soon. One more question. Okay, I'll make a quick comment. First of all, do what you just did with me, which is very good. You clarified it. You know, you're a Catholic. I presume you're a Catholic? Yeah. So you're in the church and you say, no, that's not right. That's not what the church says. So it's far more impressive coming from you than coming from me. If one of your friends says, yeah, the Catholic Church, they hate gays. If you say, no, that's not true, and explain to them why. Make that clarification. You guys are the best. I remember I was at the Youth Synod last October in Rome, you know, and the Pope was there every single day, and something he kept saying, which is dead right, is the best evangelizers of the young are the young. Which is right, it seems to me. You're the best evangelist. So that's the first move, is you say, no, that's not the church's view. Okay, here's my second general remark. The church has always been in this position, it still is, always will be. It's caught between two impulses. The first one is the call to radical sanctity. So the church's job is not to make spiritual mediocrities, it's to make saints, right? Which is why the church articulates the high ideal when it comes to anything. Think of, for example, our just war teaching. Do you ever read our just war teaching? Like the criteria that must be followed for war to be just? Man, if you follow that strictly, there's never been a just war that we've been involved in. World War II, forget it. Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, no way did those rise to the level of a just war. No way. My point there is the church is calling people to a very high level of moral excellence in economics, politics, warfare, sexuality. So do we articulate the high moral ideal, which in the church's view is sex belongs most fully within the context of a marriage between a man and a woman open to life, right? There's the church's articulation of the high moral ideal. Now, there's one side of it. Are there loads and loads and loads of people who, for a variety of reasons, find it extremely difficult to rise to that ideal? Of course, they're called sinners, right? Which is like everybody in this room last time I checked. The church, therefore, also reaches out with an equally extravagant mercy, right? The church lives in the tension between those two moves. It's the easy path is to resolve it one way or the other. Say, high moral ideal, love it or leave it, that's everything, and if you can't live up to it, tough for you. Or the other thing, which the culture wants us to say today, is, oh no, don't worry about the high moral ideal. It's really up to you. It's just a matter of personal choice. Off you go. Well, the church can't do either one of those things. It shouldn't do either one of those things. It should do both at the same time. So think of John Paul, high moral ideal. Think of Pope Francis, the field hospital of mercy. That's it. It's the two hands, the two arms. By the way, I think you guys are film people. Do you know the Coen brothers? The most spiritually alert filmmakers working today, I think. Watch their version of True Grit. Do you see it with Jeff Bridges? And did you see it? Go rent it or something. Because that's based on a deeply religious book, True Grit. But keeping in mind the two arms of law and mercy, and watch how that theme goes right through the whole movie. And who's got two arms, who's only got one arm, makes a big difference. The church has to go through life with the two arms of high moral ideal and mercy. And I think that's the way to contextualize the issue. But you tell them what the church teaches. That's far more important. Good. Do we have to close, Father? Okay, uno más. Go ahead.
So I have a lot of friends who are part of the LGBT community, and they've expressed the concern that if they feel vocation or a call to love someone of the same sex, is that vocational call still real in the Catholic Church? And if it is, why isn't it verified through the same-sex marriage?
Yeah, so again, the question about LGBT and relationships, and if someone really feels like a call from God to be in this relationship. Again, the church has nothing against friendship, even very deep friendship. What it stands against is certain expressions of sexuality in the physical sense that go against the high moral ideal I was talking about. So might people feel a deep call to a friendship that's blessed by God? Yeah, sure, I have no quarrel with that. But it's the acting out of that in certain physical ways the church would say no to. But then always reaching out in an attitude of mercy and forgiveness and love, compassion. And that's the tension. So I would say that the deep friendship part of it, someone might feel sure that's a godly reality, but the church would draw a certain line,
Okay. Well, we teach it don't become experience, you'd love to stay here the rest of the day, right? But you can't. Sorry. So we thank Bishop Barron for taking.